Hello, my name is James Titcombe. It's Friday the 14th of August 2015, and I would like to talk to you today about my experience of the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. Now, my experience started in tragic circumstances because in November 2008 I lost my baby son as a result of failures in his care at Furness General Hospital, part of the Morecambe Bay Trust. And Joshua, although he collapsed at Furness General, he was later transferred to Newcastle, where he underwent intensive care and, despite everyone's best efforts, died sadly as a consequence of an untreated infection that we now know could have been treated very easily had he been given appropriate care at Furness General Hospital. Now, the coroner in Newcastle at the time refused to open an inquest. He said Joshua had died of natural causes, but advised our family to go through the NHS complaints process for answers as to what went wrong and why. So we did that, and we weren't happy with the way the Trust responded. We felt that their investigation left many unanswered questions, and more worryingly, by this stage, I had made contact with other people in the community who seemed to have experienced similar failures with similar tragic outcomes. So in early 2009, I went to the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, which is the only appeals process in the NHS. If you're not satisfied with the Trust's response, the system is that you go to the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. So I went to them in early 2009, and it took an extremely long time for them to reach a decision. And at that time, I was so distressed by what had happened. I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. It was such a horrible thing to go through, to wait for a decision. And then there were various occasions when the decision was delayed, and it dragged on and on and on. But in February 2010, so quite a long time after Joshua died, we did get a letter from the Ombudsman at the time, Anne Abraham, refusing to investigate, and I couldn't believe this. And some of the reasons just seemed so ridiculous to me. You know, that these medical records had gone missing, so it's unlikely that we could find out what happened and why. And my view was, surely if the medical records are missing, that's a reason to investigate, not a reason not to investigate. Anyway, in February, so the 9th of February, I wrote this letter back to the Ombudsman. I'd just like to read you the closing paragraph of my letter. I wrote, in closing the door on us, this is now the final word on Joshua's life. No criticisms, no recommendations, no chance for us to ever get the answers we need. My son was taken away from me, but the saddest memory is not his death, but the events that took place afterwards. I have begged and begged for your help. Not because I think you can bring Joshua back, but because I genuinely don't want to see any other family go through the experience we have. I believe with all my heart that you have missed an opportunity to ensure that what happened after Joshua died is never repeated. And this letter fell on deaf ears, really. We did get an internal review, and that internal review said no, the Ombudsman's decision was right not to investigate. Now, after that happened, so in February 2010, it seemed that we had nowhere to go. But what I actually did was I went back to the coroner in Newcastle, and over a period of several weeks wrote letters backwards and forwards, and eventually managed to persuade the coroner in Newcastle to open an inquest. That inquest was transferred to Barrow, and it took place in the middle of 2011, so quite a long time after Joshua died. And the inquest revealed quite serious findings. The coroner was very critical, and he wrote what was known as a Rule 43 letter, which is a letter that sets out his concerns that unless something's done, there may be reoccurrence. Other deaths might happen because of the same failures. He also said that the midwives must have collaborated on their evidence, because he didn't believe that some of the evidence they gave, which I'll talk about a bit later. And this inquest triggered, finally, quite a big response. So the regulator, the Care Quality Commission, then went into the Trust and found lots of serious problems. Monitor did a review of the maternity services, which again was absolutely damning. It found that there were serious systemic risks to mothers and babies. and the whole truth slowly started to emerge at that point. Now, this eventually triggered, through campaigning with other families, the Morecambe Bay investigation, which was published earlier this year by Dr. Bill Kirkup. And throughout this period of time, I've tried to gain an acceptance from the Ombudsman that they were wrong in not investigating Joshua's death, and really a commitment for them to learn lessons. And I wrote to them last year setting out all my concerns, and they undertook to answer them. And actually Mick Martin, the managing director, wrote a letter to me which was published as a news item on the Ombudsman website, even though it was quite a personal letter, and actually I think misrepresents me, but that's what happened, and it still is available. It's still a published news item on their website, this letter to me dated August 2014, and if you Google James Titcombe Ombudsman letter, I'm sure you will find it. I just want to read you a small part of this letter from Mick Martin. It says, "I do not accept that our actions increase the risk to mothers and babies at Furness General Hospital. In fact, I believe that this suggestion is inappropriate and wrong. An investigation by us would not have brought to light any earlier the concerns." Well, as I was saying, the Morecambe Bay investigation by Bill Kirkup, published earlier this year, found quite a different conclusion, and the report, and I'm quoting directly from the report, "The PHSO failed to take opportunities that could have brought the problems to light sooner." I think that's quite clear, and it's quite serious. And of course, what the Morecambe Bay report also said was that following Joshua's death, another 6 lives were lost at Furness General Hospital due to systemic failures of a similar nature to those that led to Joshua's death. So you would have thought that the Ombudsman might have apologised for that and really set out how it was learning. But no, this letter in fact is still on the Ombudsman website to this day. Quite appalling, I think. Now the second issue I'd like to talk about is this. Now this is a report that was written by Julie Mellor in The Guardian just this week, and I'm just going to read you a section of it. "The government's pledge to change the way midwives have been regulated for more than 100 years is momentous and will improve the safety of mothers and babies." And Julie Mellor writes, "This landmark decision came as a result of families making complaints to the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman after going through agonising ordeals with their loved ones during pregnancy and childbirth. We owe them a debt of gratitude, as their actions will help improve maternity services for mothers and babies in the future." But what I'd like to do actually is set out to you the full circumstances to how this Ombudsman's report came to exist. And what happened was, after the Ombudsman refused to investigate Joshua's case, I became very, very concerned about this local supervisory system. And what happened was, it's a system, it's a national system where a member of the local supervisory authority will take a review of an untoward outcome and make recommendations to do with training or disciplinary action for the midwives involved, and wider lessons. And when we got this report, it was absolutely appalling. It had taken statements as fact from midwives when we knew, and we challenged them and we knew they weren't true. It was very, very full of mitigation, and seemed to us to distort the truth in a way that wasn't acceptable. And I complained to the Ombudsman, and they reviewed my complaint, and they refused to investigate. They said there's no evidence of maladministration. So I then again went through the internal appeals process, and it was reviewed, and the review decision came back and said, "We agree, we support the original decision, we're not going to investigate." I then found out that actually the only way to challenge the Ombudsman is by what's known as a judicial review. And I found out on the internet that the first stage of a judicial review was to write a letter before claim. So I wrote a letter before claim, very detailed, it took me a long time, setting out the arguments, as if a solicitor was writing it, but I was writing it, and submitted it to the Ombudsman. And I just want to draw attention to the letter that the Ombudsman sent me at the time. So this is dated the 3rd of April 2012. And this is what the Ombudsman say. They said, the courts have confirmed that the Ombudsman has a very wide discretion when considering whether to investigate a complaint. The Ombudsman considers that your application for judicial review would be without merit. So that's the letter to me. But actually, I obtained under the Data Protection Act some more information and some internal documents that show actually what was going on with the thought processes inside the Ombudsman at the time. And this is what they say. They say, we declined to investigate on the basis that we saw no evidence of maladministration. A subsequent review was completed of that decision in September 2011. The review found no further action should be taken. Following receipt of a letter before claim from Mr Titcombe, the legal team are concerned that we would not be able to defend the review decision in court and have asked for a re-review of the original decision not to investigate. So the letter to me at the time said the Ombudsman considers that your application for judicial review would be without merit, yet internally the legal advice is the legal team are concerned that we would not be able to defend the review decision in court. And I think that shows the how disingenuous the Ombudsman are in their dealings. And eventually, the Ombudsman did decide to investigate. But again, the internal documents I just want to draw your attention to. This is the Ombudsman do risk assessments all the time, and in all the documents I've obtained, there's lots and lots of risk assessments. But they're not about the risk to service users that might be raised from a complaint, like you might expect. The risk assessments are very much focused on risk to the Ombudsman and their reputation. And this is an internal document that's discussing whether the Ombudsman should investigate my complaint about the local supervisory authority, the complaint that led to this report that Julie Mellor is writing about and has written about this week in The Guardian. I'll read it to you. It will be very difficult to manage the communication of a decision to decline Mr Titcombe's case on the basis that we now think their concerns are more properly in NMC territory, so they're thinking of reasons why not to investigate. And they've ruled that one out. We did not put that forward as an argument previously in the Titcombe case. There has already been much publicity surrounding these cases, and again, and any decision to decline again is likely to be scrutinised in the media, and this would be difficult to explain. So Julie Mellor here is talking about mothers and babies and improving maternity care. Actually, internally, they're talking about investigating for quite different reasons. And again, I think it's quite indicative of the culture that I've experienced continuously in all my dealings with the Ombudsman. So the final issue I'd like to talk about today is the issue of, at the inquest, the coroner accused the midwives of collaborating over their evidence, and this made the headlines the next day. It was very widely reported. And I made inquiries with the Trust and asked for any information mentioning my family from the Trust under a DPA request. And when I did this, I found a document that really shocked me, and it was titled Joshua Titcombe Inquest Question and Answers. And it had a list of what I could only describe as possible questions that the coroner might ask, with what looked like model answers, and it did read like the evidence that was given at the inquest, including the evidence that led the coroner to make this assertion that the midwives must have collaborated. So it seemed to me to be very clear evidence that the preparations for Joshua's inquest weren't proper. I made a complaint to the Trust, and that complaint was dismissed. I then went to the Ombudsman, and the Ombudsman eventually decided to have an investigation. Now, and again, we talk about risk ratings, and it's not to do with the risk of service users, it's about their risk. And I'll just read to you, this is the risk consideration before they accepted to investigate my complaint, and it said, there are specific risks attached to whatever decision we might take. If we decline to investigate, it seems likely that Mr Titcombe would challenge that decision. Alternatively, it's conceivable that if we investigated, we would have to consider making a finding about the reasonable use of legal advice in preparing for hearings. That would appear risky in terms of our reputation, especially if we were to find, as seems likely, that it is at least acceptable for a body to talk to witnesses about what they will experience and what questions they are likely to be asked at an inquest. that might not sit well with our principles of openness and accountability. So they're already talking about likely findings before they've even carried out the investigation, as seems likely, which I think is very, very interesting. So eventually they carried out their investigation and they published it last year, their report. And to my absolute shock, really, they found that I'll read you the decision, which is still published on the website. I do not uphold the complaint. This is because I have found no evidence that the Trust, when preparing for the inquest, failed to comply with the law or act in accordance with established good practice. I've seen no evidence that the Trust solicitor acted inappropriately, and no evidence that the midwives colluded to present false evidence about their knowledge or the implications of a low temperature in a baby. In short, I found no evidence of maladministration. Now, when I got the draft Ombudsman's report, I was very emotional, very angry, and I wrote a very quick email back that was the kind of email when you've been through something like we have and you feel very frustrated and very angry, you might write in haste. And when they actually published the report, they didn't seem to take any notice of the arguments I was presenting, but when they published their report, they printed that email in full, so all the staff involved in this will have seen that very emotive email that really was written at a time of anger, and they didn't ask me about that, and I think that was quite malicious, really, and unnecessary, and caused a great deal of upset. But it was not the end of the story. I appealed the decision and it was supported, as you might expect. The internal Ombudsman's review process confirmed it was the right decision. But then we had the Kirkup report, which looked at the same issue in much more detail, of course, because over a considerable period of time where they interviewed witnesses, did a really proper investigation. I'd like to read you what the Kirkup report concluded. Many of the reactions of maternity unit staff at this stage were shaped by denial that there was a problem, their rejection of criticism of them that they felt was unjustified and which on occasion turned to hostility, and a strong group mentality among midwives characterised as the musketeers. We found clear evidence of distortion of the truth in responses to investigation, including particularly the supposed universal lack of knowledge of the significance of hypothermia in a newborn baby. And in this context, events such as the disappearance of records, although capable of innocent explanation, concerned us. We also found evidence of inappropriate distortion of the process of preparation for an inquest, with circulation of what we could only describe as model answers. So that's the conclusion of the Kirkup report. The Trust themselves have since written to the Ombudsman, and this is what the current Chief Executive of the Trust says. Since, and this is a letter to the Ombudsman, to Mick Martin, since writing to you early this month, we have also clarified our position formally with Mr Titcombe regarding the preparations for inquests. Whilst it is appropriate that staff are supported ahead of an inquest to ensure they understand what is expected of them as part of this extremely important process, what isn't acceptable is that staff are coached or provided with model answers on what to say. We concur with the findings of Dr Kirkup. The way the Trust prepared for the inquest of Joshua Titcombe went too far, particularly the way it circulated model answers to the midwives. This was wrong. So that's the position of the Trust, and that's the position of the Kirkup investigation. However, I've since gone back to the Ombudsman and I've asked them repeatedly to withdraw their report, and remember, this report that's published contains emails from me, and I just hoped that they would really apologise for getting that wrong, and they would do everything possible to learn from why they got their investigation so badly wrong, and they have just refused to do that. Eventually they offered to re-review all their cases that they've ever done involving Joshua, and as you know, there's 3 internal reviews I've asked for so far, and all of them have been proved to be wrong, and I didn't want to subject myself to that, their internal review processes. I need some external review, and I think that's really what's needed here. So I think it's just absolutely damning set of circumstances. To this day, the ombudsman still have published their report. It's still in the public domain. They refuse to withdraw their report. They refuse to apologise. And this is left me and my family feeling very strongly that they are a not fit for purpose organisation. And I think there's something very, very wrong with the culture. And this is what the Parliamentary Account Select Committee said with their report into clinical investigations that published in March this year. Complainants deserve an ombudsman they can have confidence in. There are serious questions about the capacity and capability of the Ombudsman's office, in particular the relation to complaints involving clinical matters. We are aware of considerable anguish and disquiet where Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman investigations fail to uncover the truth, and of pain inflicted by the Ombudsman defensiveness and reluctance to admit mistakes. So this is what really where we are. I think there are serious issues. I think it just makes me so angry that Dame Julie Mellor is now talking about her I statement, standards for how to deal with complaints. And I think that actually if an NHS organisation treated families who raise complaints in the same way the Ombudsman have treated me and my family, then that organisation would be, without any doubt, in special measures. And it seems to me that the Ombudsman, their culture, and there's no excuse for how families like mine have been treated, mirrors the very worst of the behaviour of organisations. And actually, the way the Trust behaved to me throughout my experience with Joshua actually is on a par with how the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman have behaved. There will be reform, there's reform happening, but isn't it tragic that the opportunity to learn where they've clearly made mistakes isn't being taken, that they refuse to apologise, that they refuse to learn from the appalling set of circumstances that families like mine have had to endure. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.